It's finally warmed up in North Dakota, and the tractors are running, and things are working pretty well. And so we're feeling a little more optimistic and feeling a little more secure in what we do in the economics. Most of you know North Dakota is about 90% of the land base in North Dakota is used in agriculture. And, you know, I always tell people when people say, why should I worry about a farm bill? I tell them, well, if you look at the history of conflict across the world, conflict many times is the result of food insecurity. And so we like to think that we do a whole lot of things for national security, whether it is the oil that we produce, which is now being exported to compete against more dangerous oil producers like Russia and Iran, whether it is the food that we produce that is being exported to provide food security across the country. But one of the great national security institutions that we are most proud of in terms of our participation is our relationship with the United States Air Force, whether it's in Minot or whether it is in Grand Forks. And so we take that role very seriously, and not just because they're a major economic driver for our communities, but because we believe that our participation and our involvement with the Air Force is adding to the national security of this country. And so it's our contribution. And so I want to just start out by thanking Peter for hosting today and the work that the Mitchell Institute does with the Air Force Association to support, first and foremost, our airmen. It's a great pleasure to be here talking about an issue that I think is baseline and fundamental to our national security. I also want to thank John McMartin from the Minot Chamber of Commerce and Task Force 21 for being here. Really appreciate you guys coming all the way. In 2018, the Nuclear Posture Review set out important elements of the administration's strategic policy. We need to have conversations about this because, as I said, it is central to our national defense, and because we are talking about a long-term and significant investment. And so in October of 2017, the CBO, Congressional Budget Office, estimated that maintaining and modernizing our nuclear enterprise will cost approximately $1.2 trillion between now and 2046. Approximately $40 billion of that alone will be spent just on modernization. So to support these investments, I think that the most important thing we need is a bipartisan relationship. We can't let this become a political football. And I see it already when I'm out and about in the country. I get asked a lot about modernization. It hasn't gone without notice that among various groups that we are making this investment, and there's going to be challenges to this investment. Let's not forget that there still is a whole lot of people who would prefer that we not have these weapons at all, not have this deterrence at all. And we need to be crystal clear about the mission, and we need to be crystal clear about why it is absolutely essential to our national defense to have this deterrence. And so we will continue to push back in every way that we can, but I would also say it is critically important that this investment not be dependent on the swings of politics, you know, depending upon who's in and who's out. We're going to be in or out. If we're going to make a commitment, it has to be dialogued, it has to be bipartisan, and it has to be long-term, or we're not going to achieve what I think we need to achieve. And so this bipartisan consensus is absolutely critically important. Before I share some of my thoughts on the strategic deterrence and its modernization, I'd like to just kind of start out talking about the times that we live in. And it's interesting because when you start out, you think you know what's going to be on the horizon in terms of the threats, and there tends to be predictability, and then something happens where predictability isn't as obvious or apparent. So let's start out with the threat that Russia presents. It is clear that Russia is moving in the direction and will continue to move in the direction, if not push back and push back aggressively. What they've done in the Crimean, what they've done in the Ukraine, what they've done in cyber, and the expansion in short range, we can't ignore this. there is a game plan here. And if you think that Putin doesn't have a long-term game plan, then you're more naive than I know you are. And so we know that he is not going to be left behind. His national pride depends on he be on a player on a very large stage. What puts Russia as a player in a very large stage right now? They are the single greatest existential nuclear threat to the United States of America. So we have to be very, very, I think, eyes wide open about the role that that Russia is trying to play, whether it's in the Arctic, which we think we could play a role on, looking at the Grand Forks Air Base. There's a reason why the ballistic missiles are in North Dakota and not in California or in Washington. We share that border with Canada. We share the Arctic across North Dakota. And so we have to be very, very realistic about, I think, the threat that Russia provides, and getting deterrence right with Russia has to be one of our top national security priorities. Managing China is a little more tough. You know, and you know, I'm going to go out on a limb here and tell you that China has a plan. China doesn't do anything without a plan. I attend the McCain Institute every year, and Admiral Harris was on a panel with a couple American CEOs of large corporations. And they were talking about whether you can win in China, and they were talking about, well, you know, we're going to create scenarios where we have a win-win with China. On trade, we have a win-win on this. And Admiral Harris, that came down to his turn, head of Pacific Command, and they asked him, well, what do you think about this win-win? He goes, I'll tell you what China does. China wins and China wins. And I thought it was a real wake-up call for somebody who is probably one of the highest level experts on China's planning in the region. Clearly what's happening in the South China Sea should alarm all of us. I think we can be grateful for what's happening with diplomacy on the Korean Peninsula, but I will tell you that an American withdrawal from the Korean Peninsula going forward may in fact be a win for China. So we need to be really careful about the geopolitical involvement and what's going to happen if that happens with our relationship, whether it's on trade or whether it's on national security. Both China and Russia, I think, present very serious risks on cyber. You know, China has figured out ways to steal intellectual capital, intellectual property from us, and they will continue to engage not only in expanding their military interests in the region, but they will continue to attack us by stealing our intellectual product and by maintaining and moving their markets to places where we also want to participate. You know, without getting into a long discussion, I think one of the most serious decisions that we may look back on as a mistake is pulling out of TPP. And if you don't believe me, just talk to Admiral Harris. He'll tell you the significance of TPP to maintaining our national security and pushing back. So the NPR, I think, correctly noted that we have long sought a dialogue with China to enhance our understanding of our respective policies, doctrines, and capabilities to improve transparency and help manage risk of miscalculation and misperception. For the sake of stability, we have to get China at the table when we're talking about nuclear deterrence. I don't think that we can simply say, well, not a problem so far. I think that we have to look more broadly in terms of the region. Let's talk a little bit about North Korea. North Korea obviously felt like their program was at such a place that they knew that they had a lot of concern in this country, a lot of concern among the experts that the capabilities were growing, and they were growing quicker than what we thought they would be growing. And so it's no mistake that we're now, or no, I think, accident that everybody's attention now has turned to the Korean Peninsula to try and figure out how we're going to resolve that conflict in ways that doesn't involve military engagement. One of the concerns that I have, and I'm not going to get into the comparison with Iran, I think that we had much better intel on the Iranian capability than we do North Korea. North Korea is as a matter of understanding what exactly is going on in North Korea, I think is extraordinarily difficult. We do not know where things are in North Korea. I don't think that's a big military secret. I think you'll hear people say that. And obviously, North Korea's ability to engage in conventional weaponry against South Korea presents a real risk that you're negotiating a little bit with a gun to your head, because if, in fact, they want to destroy Seoul, they don't need to launch a nuclear weapon. They've got other capability. And so North Korea, I can only say that I'm encouraged by what you see, but I also think that Kim Jong-un is a very horrible person. I don't think he's an honorable man. I don't think that he's somebody that we can trust. And we need real partners and not partners that are overly anxious to get a deal done. And so one of the things that we have to be extraordinarily careful with is making sure that we don't somehow misalign with our allies, whether that's Japan or whether it's South Korea. And we have to be realistic about what's in our national interest and what's in the interest of our partners in the region in terms of what decisions we make about the presence that we're going to have on the peninsula. And so to, I think, say that you are going to withdraw troops, the last thing we should be doing is making any announcement unilaterally. I think we need to maintain the THAAD battery. There's a reason why we moved THAAD into the peninsula, into South Korea. That reason hasn't changed. And so we need to be very, very engaged and aggressive. And I met with then nominee Pompeo and now Secretary Pompeo and had a long conversation about transparency and better understanding of what, in fact, is happening in Korea. Iran, we'll see what happens. We've been having discussions all week about the JCPOA. I don't think we know what the next step's going to be. I will tell you that from the people who talked to some of the people within the national security team, they have told me that the national security team has assured them that the agreement will still be maintained because the Europeans have no idea about pulling out. If the administration does, in fact, impose secondary sanctions, I don't know how they cannot. And plus, I think just even the threat. Already you saw a limited investment in Iran because people were concerned about snapback. People were concerned about getting on the wrong side of a much larger market country called the United States of America. And so we want to see ongoing sanctions under the bill that we passed, sanctioning their ballistic missile program. I think there's ways that we can continue to work in the region, but the regional dynamics with proxy wars are getting very, very difficult. And we should all be very mindful that this has the potential for being the next flare-up. And I don't know what that looks like, but obviously the Syrian situation is a precursor, or at least I think an illustration of kind of what we're up against here. And so engagement again in diplomacy is absolutely critical, but also a willingness to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, a willingness to work with our partners in the region. I always say the partners in the region, I used to think, oh, Turkey. And I say, I don't know what Turkey is anymore. So you guys you probably have a better guess than I do, but certainly Israel remains our great partner. I think we have to understand how important that relationship is to our national security and how important our Israeli relationship is to stability in the region. So with that said, I think we have great challenges, and this doesn't even discuss the challenges that we have with non-nation states. This is simply running through the region where all the hot spots are, or running through the world where all the hot spots are. So given the challenges that I think are very real threats, I think we have to think about how we make investments to maintain and to support our strategic forces. The NPR laid out the administration's vision for our nation's nuclear deterrence, but its a long-term impact will depend on how the review is actually carried out, which I've already talked about. My argument is that these investments ultimately reinforce everything else we need to do in diplomatic and security areas. So if the deterrence isn't real, if our allies don't think our deterrence is real, if it's not maintained, is it really a deterrence? Is it really doing what it's supposed to do, which is to provide that backstop of prevention? We call it a deterrence for a reason, right? I mean, we call it a prevention, a clear message that we're prepared to defend ourselves against any kind of attack. And so we need to make sure that it is maintained, that we maintain it proudly, and that we talk about how it's on the ready. And if we aren't ready, if we can't talk about how it's on the ready, I don't know if it really serves the purpose that it was intended. And so that's why even skeptics, I think, like General and now Secretary Mattis on this program have now come around. General Weinstein has become a great friend of mine and Senator Tester's. Obviously, Montana, North Dakota, and Wyoming share something in common, and we spend a lot of time on this issue. And I know that General Weinstein has been very, very aggressive within the Pentagon in making sure that people understand and appreciate the role that this capability plays, and honestly, the role that the Air Force plays. You know, when people think of national security, we have to wonder, when we're boosters and supporters of the Air Force, do they see an airman, or do they see a Marine, or you know, a soldier, you know, an Army soldier? Who do they think when they see it? We want people, when they think about our national defense, to see an airman, because they're doing incredible work for us. And so promoting, not only doing the job, but promoting the job, to me, is a pretty critical piece, because that promotion of the job is going to be critical to maintaining the momentum of modernization. And if we don't keep promoting the job, I think that we will, in fact, fall down. So the NPR took some helpful steps by maintaining some fundamental continuity with past administrations. I think they maintained deliberate ambiguity regarding the kinds of attacks that would result in retaliation, emphasizing U.S. commitment to extending the umbrella to allies, reaffirming the need to keep the triad and not reduce ICBM less dyad. Importantly, Secretary Mattis, I think, reaffirmed. And the one thing I would say here is I was at the Minot Air Base when Secretary Carter, Ash Carter, came and basically laid this out. And so this isn't, you know, okay, now we're going to do it. This has been a continuation of past policies, and I think it's really important to point that out, because, as I said, it's really important that this not be subject to political win, that this be, you know, when we talk about it, we say this is not, you know, an initiative from the Trump administration. This is a continuation of a policy that was started by President Obama and by Secretary Carter. And so it is, I think, when you look at the conversations with Secretary Wilson, General Rand, General Weinstein, and other Air Force leaders, convinced me that the need to invest in readiness is absolutely critical. And that one of the roles that I can play, quite honestly, is the role of cheerleader, the role of explainer-in-chief, the role of somebody who puts up my arm when someone says we don't need that, and starts going through it chapter and verse. Because if we just simply let that take hold, and we don't get into audiences where people challenge us that way, we won't be successful. You know, I think way too often the one thing that happens on any kind of difficult issue is that people go to their corners, and as long as they win an election, they think they've won the issue. That is really bad policy. I tend to go into the lion's den and try and argue my case, because at least then I've planted a seed of doubt in somebody else's mind about what they're saying. And so we can't just sit in rooms like this where we know there's no, who doesn't think we should modernize here? Yeah, no one. So the attitude that we have of preaching to the already, converted is not the best way to pursue this. And so being in communities like Minot, being in communities, even in New York City, talking about how important this is, I think, is absolutely critical. So looking forward, I remain optimistic that there's a bipartisan agreement on the programs that'll be necessary to develop the further nuclear force. I think that if you know the ground-based strategic deterrent will be upgraded. I mean, you guys know the whole list. In modernizing our nuclear force, we can't lose sight of the platforms that protect the triad, replacing the outdated helicopters in Minot, which has been, I think it's in the defense authorization this time, right? And we've been very aggressive on re-engineering the B-52s. We think that's a platform that's worked well for us. I think that platform will continue to fly for a long, long time, as long as we maintain it, but we can't have engines falling off in mid-sky. Secretary Wilson's recent testimony before the Senate Armed Services Committee noted that both the GBSD and the LRSO are on budget and ahead of schedule in the risk reduction phase of their development. And this is what the people of North Dakota expected. I think that, one thing about working in North Dakota and one thing about making an investment in North Dakota, people show up, they do their job, they give you an honest day's work for a buck, and we think that it's a great place to do business. And so never forget that where you are in terms of investments can depend on how far those investments go. And so we fully expect that investments in North Dakota will exceed expectations in terms of what we will be able to achieve, looking at every dollar. And so, we can talk a little bit about short range and where we think that's at, if you want to do that. But I want to close there and just simply say, if nothing else out of this, is that we live in a dangerous world. We cannot say we have a deterrence if we don't maintain it. We have to make these investments, but in order to make these investments long-term, we have to win the hearts and minds beyond, industry, beyond, the staff at the Pentagon or the staff at the Armed Services Committee. It has to be a message that is broader than that. And we have to make sure that someone running for a job somewhere, when they say we're going to cut $400 billion out because we don't need to modernize, that we're on the ready to say, excuse me, let me explain why that's not true. Because a $1.4 or $1.2 trillion investment over this period of time doesn't happen without a lot of public support. So with that, I'll just close and answer any questions you have, but let you know that one of the things that we all wring our hands and talk about, the lack of civility and bipartisanship in the United States, and certainly in the United States Senate. Think about this. We've never missed a defense reauthorization. You can't say that about everything, let me tell you, but we've never missed a defense authorization. And that's because chairmen like Levin, chairmen like Senator McCain, chairman, ranking members like Levin, ranking members like Jack Reed won't let that happen. They are going to bring a defense authorization. And that defense authorization is so important because it is the outline of public policy. It provides the yeah, what about? And it is, in fact, a functioning, sequestration has been bad. There's no doubt about it. We need to figure out how we unwind that. We unwound it for a little bit here. But the looming, threat of sequestration continues to prevent long-term planning. We've got to think about that, but you also have to realize that as it relates to the national security of this country and defense authorization, it is the single biggest success of the United States Congress because we do it every year and typically on time.